Long before Moscow was even a footnote in history, the golden domes of Kiev gleamed as the crown jewel of Eastern Europe. This is the story of Kievan Rus, the first great Ukrainian empire that would lay the foundation for centuries of struggle, glory, and independence. Picture the year 860 AD. While Western Europe trembled before Viking longships, a different breed of Norse warriors, the Varangians, or Rus, carved their destiny along the mighty rivers of what is now Ukraine. These weren't mere raiders, they were empire builders. When Rurik established his realm in Novgorod, his successors pushed southward until they encountered an ancient Slavic settlement founded by a chieftain named Kii. This city, Kiev, would become the heart of their new empire. Under Prince Volodymyr the Great, Kievan Rus transformed from a pagan warrior state into the largest Christian empire in Eastern Europe. In 988, Volodymyr's conversion to Orthodox Christianity didn't just change a ruler's faith, it forged the spiritual identity of the Ukrainian people for millennia to come. His son, Yaroslav the Wise, elevated this empire to unprecedented heights. Known as both the lawgiver and the builder, Yaroslav turned Kiev into a metropolis of 45,000 souls that rivaled London, Paris, and Vienna in splendor. The magnificent St. Sophia's Cathedral, the Golden Gate, and countless monasteries rose under his rule. More importantly, Yaroslav established the legal foundations, educational systems, and cultural institutions that would define Ukrainian civilization. While Moscow remained an obscure village, Kiev was already being called the Mother of Cities. This empire stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, encompassing modern Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Russia. It was here that the Cyrillic alphabet took root, where Orthodox Christianity flourished, and where the democratic traditions of the Rada, popular assemblies, first emerged. The Kievan Rus wasn't just Ukraine's first empire, it was the crucible where Ukrainian identity was forged in fire, faith, and freedom. When the Mongol storm swept across Eastern Europe in 1240, it seemed the dream of Ukrainian statehood had died in the flames of Kiev. But from the ashes of the old empire, a new kingdom would rise. One that would dare to crown itself with papal blessing and challenge the mightiest powers of its age. The kingdom of Ruthenia emerged from the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia, united in 1199 under Prince Roman Mstislavich. But it was his son, Danilo Romanovich, who would transform this principality into a true Ukrainian kingdom. Facing the impossible choice between Mongol Khans, Polish kings, and Hungarian armies, Danilo made a masterstroke of medieval diplomacy. In 1253, Pope Innocent IV's legate placed a crown upon Danilo's head in the ancient city of Dorogochin. With this act, the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia became the Kingdom of Ruthenia, the first state in history to bear the name that would echo through centuries as the identity of the Ukrainian people. From his capital in Lviv, King Danilo ruled over a realm that stretched across modern western Ukraine and into Belarus. This was no mere survival story, it was a renaissance. The Kingdom of Ruthenia became a bridge between East and West, where Orthodox Christianity met Catholic Europe, where Byzantine art merged with Gothic architecture, and where the Ukrainian language began to diverge from its Old Church Slavonic roots. The kingdom established its own metropolitanate, creating ecclesiastical independence from both Moscow and Rome. Ruthenian merchants traded from Krakow to Constantinople, while Ruthenian knights defended Christianity's eastern frontier. Though the direct line of Danilo would end in 1323, the Kingdom of Ruthenia had achieved something remarkable. It had created the first distinctly Ukrainian state, separate from both Russian and Polish identity. The very name Ukrainian wouldn't emerge for centuries, but the people who would bear it had already proven they could build kingdoms worthy of crowns. In the wild steppes of the Dnieper River, where Polish nobles squeezed Orthodox peasants into serfdom and Tatar slavers prowled the grasslands, something extraordinary was taking shape. They called themselves Cossacks, free men. Runaway serfs, defrocked priests, bankrupt nobles, and rogue Tatar mercenaries united not by blood, but by a hunger for freedom. From their island fortress, beyond the rapids, they created a society where wealth was shared, leaders were elected, and any man could rise through merit alone. The Cossacks perfected the art of war, striking like lightning from their boats, rescuing Christian slaves, and developing battle formations that could break the finest cavalry charges. When Polish magnates tried to seize the lands of Cossack officer Bohdan Khmelnytsky in 1648, they lit the fuse of revolution, and so began the rise of Europe's first democratic Christian republic, forged in the flames of freedom. Khmelnytsky's genius lay not just in his military skill, but in his ability to unite all of Ukrainian society behind the Cossack banner. Orthodox peasants saw liberation from Catholic oppression. Townspeople glimpsed freedom from foreign domination. Even Orthodox nobles joined the cause when Khmelnytsky proclaimed himself heir to the princes of Kievan Rus. The revolution that followed was total. In battles at Jovty Vody and Korsun, Cossack infantry and Tatar cavalry shattered Polish armies. From village to village, Ukrainian peasants rose against their overlords. By winter 1648, Khmelnytsky had entered Kiev in triumph, where the Orthodox Metropolitan proclaimed him prince and declared his war a holy crusade. The Cossack hetmanate was born, not as a monarchy or aristocracy, but as something unprecedented in European history. Here, the hetman was elected by the Rada of all registered Cossacks. Here, peasants were free men who could choose their own paths. Here, towns governed themselves under ancient rights. Karl Marx himself would later call it Europe's first democratic Christian republic. For the first time since the fall of Kievan Rus, Ukrainian lands were ruled by Ukrainians, in the Ukrainian language, according to Ukrainian customs. The Cossack Revolution had created an empire of freedom. The birth of the Cossack hetmanate sent shockwaves across Eastern Europe. For the first time in centuries, a Ukrainian state had declared independence, but independence would prove far more difficult to maintain than to achieve. Bohdan Khmelnytsky quickly learned that victory in revolution was only the beginning. At the catastrophic Battle of Berestechko in 1651, the Crimean Khan abandoned the Cossacks mid-battle, leaving them to face annihilation by Polish artillery. On January 8, 1654, in the town of Pereyaslav, Hetman Khmelnytsky and his officers swore allegiance to Tsar Alexei of Muscovy. This was not the joyful reunion Soviet propaganda would later claim. The Cossacks and Russians needed interpreters to communicate. But the ruin that followed Khmelnytsky's death in 1657 nearly destroyed the young state. The hetmanate split along the Dnieper River, left bank under Russian influence, right bank under Polish control. The chaos reached its peak under Petro Doroshenko, who desperately turned to the Ottoman Empire for protection. When Ottoman armies marched into Ukraine in 1672, they brought not liberation, but devastation. Churches became mosques, Christians were enslaved, and Ukrainian lands were laid waste. The price of Ottoman protection proved too high, and Doroshenko was forced to submit to Moscow in disgrace. Through this period of civil wars and foreign interventions, one truth became clear. Ukraine's geographic position made pure independence nearly impossible. Every hetman faced the same brutal choice. Which great power offered the best terms for Ukrainian autonomy? The dream of full independence lived on, but the reality was a constant struggle to preserve whatever self-governance was possible within the constraints of great power politics. The most tragic aspect of the ruin was not the foreign interference, but how it turned Ukrainians against each other. Cossack fought Cossack, Orthodox believers sided with Catholic powers, and the democratic institutions that had made the hetmanate unique began to crumble under the weight of constant warfare. Yet even in defeat, the hetmanate had proven something crucial. Ukrainians could govern themselves, could build democratic institutions, and could maintain their distinct identity even under foreign suzerainty. The empire of the Cossacks would face its greatest test under the last truly independent hetman, Ivan Mazepa. Ivan Mazepa embodied everything the Cossack elite aspired to be. Fluent in 7 languages, educated in the finest European universities, a poet, diplomat, and warrior who moved with equal grace through the courts of Paris and the camps of Zaporizhzhia. For 21 years, he would rule the Hetmanate as its last truly independent leader, presiding over a golden age of Ukrainian culture while navigating the treacherous waters of great power politics. When Mazepa became hetman in 1687, he inherited a state walking a tightrope. The hetmanate remained nominally autonomous under Russian suzerainty, but Moscow's grip was tightening with each passing year. Mazepa's genius lay in making himself indispensable to Tsar Peter the Great. He served as Russia's chief diplomat in the Islamic world, led Cossack armies to victory in the Azov campaigns, and helped Peter understand the complex politics of Eastern Europe. Under Mazepa's patronage, Kyiv experienced a renaissance that rivaled its medieval glory. The distinctive Ukrainian Baroque architecture that still graces the city today rose during his reign. St. Michael's golden-domed monastery, the reconstructed St. Sophia's Cathedral, and dozens of other monuments proclaimed that Ukrainian culture was alive and flourishing. But Mazepa was building more than churches. He was nurturing a generation of Ukrainian intellectuals who would preserve their nation's identity through the dark centuries ahead. Schools proliferated throughout the Hetmanate, creating literacy rates that surpassed most of Europe. The Ukrainian language flowered in literature, theology, and scholarship. This cultural renaissance would prove Mazepa's most lasting legacy. The crisis came during the Great Northern War. Peter the Great demanded ever more sacrifices from Ukraine, tens of thousands of Cossack lives lost in foreign campaigns, Ukrainian laborers dying in the swamps while building St. Petersburg, and Ukrainian resources stripped away to fund Russian ambitions. When Peter ordered Mazepa to use scorched earth tactics against Swedish forces approaching Ukraine, the aging hetman had reached his limit. At nearly 70 years old, Mazepa made the decision that would define him in history. In November 1708, he broke with Russia and allied with Swedish King Charles XII. Peter's response was swift and brutal. Russian forces sacked Mazepa's capital of Baturin, massacring 10,000 civilians and destroying the city so thoroughly it would never recover. The terror campaign worked. Most Cossack regiments abandoned Mazepa and sided with Russia. The Battle of Poltava on July 8, 1709, decided not just the fate of the Great Northern War, but the future of Ukrainian independence. On Ukrainian soil, the armies of Sweden and Russia clashed in one of history's most decisive battles. Mazepa's 7,000 Cossacks fought alongside 25,000 Swedes against a Russian force twice their size. The result was catastrophic defeat. Swedish power was broken forever, and with it died the last hope of Ukrainian independence for centuries. Mazepa fled to Ottoman territory, where he died in exile 9 months later. With his death ended not just a reign, but an era. Yet Mazepa's true victory lay not in the battles he won or lost, but in the culture he preserved. The Ukrainian language, Orthodox faith, and democratic traditions he nurtured would survive centuries of oppression to bloom again in independence. With the destruction of the Hetmanate in 1764 and the Zaporizhzhian Sich in 1775, Ukrainian independence seemed to die forever. Catherine the Great renamed the conquered lands Novorossiya, New Russia, as if to erase their Ukrainian identity entirely. But she underestimated the power of historical memory and the stubborn refusal of a people to simply disappear into the Russian imperial embrace. The early decades of Russian rule brought catastrophic changes to Ukrainian society. The free peasants who had been the backbone of Cossack democracy were shackled into serfdom, practical slavery that bound them to the land of Russian noble estates. The Cossack starshina, once elected leaders of free communities, were transformed into Russian nobility, their estates granted in exchange for imperial service. Many embraced Russification, sending their sons to Russian schools and speaking Russian in their homes. Yet resistance took many forms. Some former Cossacks were relocated to distant frontiers, where they maintained their martial traditions while serving as the Tsar's border guards. Others preserved Ukrainian folk culture in songs, stories, and customs that no imperial decree could destroy. The Ukrainian language lived on in villages and markets, even as it was banned from schools and government. The real awakening began in the universities that Russia established to educate Ukrainian elites. The University of Kyiv and Kharkiv University were meant to create loyal Russian subjects, but they produced something unexpected, a generation of Ukrainian intellectuals who refused to accept that their people were merely little Russians, temporarily separated from their great Russian brothers. Professor Mykola Kostomarov became the father of Ukrainian historiography, arguing that Ukrainians had always been a distinct people with their own democratic traditions. Panteleimon Kulish wrote novels that romanticized the Cossack past and translated the Bible into Ukrainian. But it was Taras Shevchenko, the serf who became Ukraine's national poet, who gave voice to Ukrainian dreams of freedom. In the shadow of Imperial Russia, when Ukrainian was forbidden and Russian declared supreme, one poet's defiant verses ignited a flame that could not be extinguished. Taras Shevchenko, writing in his banned native tongue, awakened a spirit of resistance that would echo through generations. The discovery of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood in 1847 brought swift punishment. Shevchenko, sentenced to serve as a common soldier, was forbidden to write or paint. But his words had already taken root in Ukrainian soil. The empire's response grew desperate. The Valuev Circular declared Ukrainian language non-existent. The Ems Ukaz banned it entirely, from schools, theaters, even churches. But with each restriction, resistance only grew stronger. In hidden rooms and secret gatherings, the hromadas kept Ukrainian culture alive. Teachers whispered forbidden history lessons. Writers smuggled their works abroad. The more the empire tried to crush Ukrainian identity, the more it flourished. By 1917, the Ukrainian spirit remained unbroken. The empire had conquered the land, but failed to conquer the soul of a people determined to be free. February 1917 brought the news Ukrainians had dreamed of for generations. The Romanov dynasty had fallen. After centuries of imperial oppression, the winds of freedom were sweeping across the Russian Empire. In Kyiv, Ukrainian politicians, intellectuals, and activists rushed to form the Central Rada, a provisional government that would attempt to guide their nation from autonomy to independence. Under the leadership of historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky, the Central Rada initially sought autonomy within a democratic Russian federation. Their first universal declared, "From now on, we alone will create our life," but stopped short of full independence. This cautious approach reflected the precarious reality. Ukraine lacked an army, controlled only a few cities, and faced threats from multiple directions. Everything changed when Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917. The Central Rada responded by proclaiming the Ukrainian People's Republic in November, and when Bolshevik armies invaded in December, Ukraine declared full independence in its fourth universal. The dream of 1648 seemed within reach once more, but independence required more than declarations. The Bolshevik invasion in early 1918 overwhelmed the nascent Ukrainian army, capturing city after city in a campaign marked by systematic terror against anyone who spoke Ukrainian or supported independence. Kyiv fell after 11 days of bombardment, and Red Terror swept the country. Salvation came from an unexpected source. Germany and Austria, desperate for Ukrainian grain to feed their starving populations, recognized Ukrainian independence and sent armies to expel the Bolsheviks. By March 1918, German and Austrian troops had restored Ukrainian control, but at a devastating price. Ukraine had traded Bolshevik occupation for German occupation. The Germans, suspicious of the socialist Central Rada, engineered a coup that brought Pavlo Skoropadsky to power as hetman of Ukraine. For 8 months, this descendant of a Cossack hetman ruled under German protection, establishing the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences and promoting education while struggling to balance German demands for grain with Ukrainian needs for autonomy. Germany's defeat in November 1918 left Ukraine exposed once again. The directorate led by Simon Petliura overthrew Skoropadsky, but faced immediate threats from all directions. The Bolsheviks renewed their invasion from the east, Poland claimed western Ukrainian lands and captured Lviv after fierce fighting. French intervention forces landed in the south. Anarchist Nestor Makhno controlled vast territories with his Black Army. The brief union of eastern and western Ukrainian republics in January 1919 represented the high water mark of Ukrainian independence hopes. For a moment, it seemed that Ukraine might overcome the chaos and emerge as a unified, independent state. But the moment passed quickly. By 1920, the last hopes of the Ukrainian People's Republic had been crushed. The Bolsheviks controlled most of the country. Poland had seized Galicia and Volhynia, and Romanian forces occupied northern Bukovina. The dream of independence lay in ruins, with hundreds of thousands dead and the country devastated by 4 years of constant warfare. Yet the struggle had not been in vain. Unlike in 1764, when Ukrainian independence died quietly with administrative decrees, the 1917 to 1921 period had seen Ukrainians prove they could govern themselves, could build democratic institutions, and could maintain their distinct identity even in the face of overwhelming odds. More importantly, the very fact that Ukraine had declared independence and fought for it forced even the Bolsheviks to recognize Ukrainian distinctiveness. When the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was established in 1922 as a founding member of the USSR, it represented both defeat and victory. Defeat because independence was lost. Victory because Ukraine was recognized as a separate nation rather than simply being absorbed into Russia. The phoenix of Ukrainian statehood had risen from the ashes, even if it wore Soviet chains. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was born from the ashes of independence, a bitter compromise that promised autonomy within the new Soviet Union while delivering increasing oppression under communist rule. What followed would be 7 decades of the most systematic attempt in history to destroy Ukrainian national identity, and the equally remarkable story of how that identity survived. The early Soviet period offered false hope. Lenin's new economic policy brought prosperity after years of war, while his Korenizatsiya policy promoted Ukrainian language and culture within a Soviet framework. Ukrainian schools multiplied, Ukrainian literature flourished, and for a brief moment it seemed that Soviet Ukraine might preserve the essence of Ukrainian identity while enjoying the benefits of modernization. That illusion died with Stalin's rise to power. The 1928 show trials targeting the fictional Union for the Liberation of Ukraine marked the beginning of systematic terror against Ukrainian intellectuals. Scientists, teachers, writers, and artists, the cream of Ukrainian society, were arrested, executed, or sent to die in Soviet labor camps. Stalin was determined to decapitate Ukrainian nationalism by destroying its intellectual leadership, but Stalin's greatest weapon against Ukraine was hunger. The collectivization campaign that began in 1929 was designed not just to modernize agriculture, but to break the backbone of Ukrainian society, its independent peasantry. When Ukrainian farmers resisted having their land and livestock seized, Stalin's response was genocidal in its scope and intent. The Holodomor of 1932 to 1933 stands as one of history's most horrific man-made famines. Stalin set impossible grain quotas for Ukraine, then sent armed brigades to confiscate not just the harvest, but every scrap of food from peasant homes. Ukrainian villages were sealed off to prevent escape. Those caught taking even a handful of grain faced execution under Stalin's Law of 5 Stalks. As many as 6 million Ukrainians died of starvation while the Soviet Union exported grain to Western Europe. Children orphaned by the famine were shot as enemies of the people. Stalin's Lieutenant Lazar Kaganovich coldly declared, "The peasant wants to strangle the Soviet government with the scrawny hand of hunger. We will show him what hunger really is." World War II brought new devastation to Ukraine. Nazi occupation from 1941 to 1944 resulted in the murder of over 1 million Ukrainian Jews and the enslavement of millions more Ukrainians for forced labor in Germany. Soviet liberation brought little relief. Stalin viewed any Ukrainian who had survived German occupation as potentially treasonous. The post-war period saw renewed campaigns of Russification and cultural suppression. The Ukrainian insurgent army continued guerrilla warfare against Soviet forces until the early 1950s, fighting for an independence that seemed more distant than ever. Hundreds of thousands of suspected nationalist sympathizers were deported to Siberian labor camps, yet Ukrainian identity proved impossible to destroy. During the Khrushchev thaw of the 1950s and early 1960s, a new generation of Ukrainian intellectuals, the 60ers, began cautiously reasserting Ukrainian culture. Poets like Vasyl Stus, historians like Ivan Juba, and activists like Vyacheslav Chornovil kept alive the memory of Ukrainian independence and the dream of its restoration. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster became a catalyst for Ukrainian awakening. Soviet incompetence and cover-ups during the nuclear catastrophe exposed the regime's fundamental inability to protect its own people. As Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost policies allowed more open discussion, Ukrainian activists formed organizations like Ruch that openly demanded independence. On August 24, 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed around them, the Ukrainian parliament declared independence. In December, 90% of Ukrainians voted to confirm that declaration in a referendum that crossed all ethnic and regional lines. After 7 decades of Soviet rule, Ukraine was free once more. August 24, 1991, for the third time in its history, Ukraine declared independence. But unlike the brief experiments of 1648 and 1918, this time the declaration would stick. The blue and yellow flag that had flown over Cossack armies and revolutionary governments once again flew over Kiev, this time to stay. Yet independence was only the beginning of Ukraine's greatest challenge, building a modern democratic state while facing the perpetual threat of Russian imperial ambitions. The early years of independence tested Ukrainian resolve like never before. The collapse of Soviet central planning devastated the economy. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. Corrupt oligarchs seized control of major industries while ordinary Ukrainians struggled to survive. The 1990s became known as the Wild 90s, a period when many questioned whether independence had been worth the price. Russia never accepted Ukrainian independence as permanent. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum seemed to offer security. Ukraine gave up the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal in exchange for guarantees of territorial integrity from Russia, the United States, and Britain. But Vladimir Putin's rise to power brought a more aggressive Russian policy aimed at bringing Ukraine back under Moscow's control. The 2004 Orange Revolution marked Ukraine's first great test of democratic resolve. When presidential candidate Viktor Yanukovych attempted to steal the election through massive fraud, millions of Ukrainians took to the streets in peaceful protest. For weeks, Kiev's Independence Square became a symbol of democratic resistance. The revolution's success brought Viktor Yushchenko to power and seemed to set Ukraine firmly on a European path. But the Orange Revolution's promise remained unfulfilled. Corruption continued to plague Ukrainian politics. Oligarchs maintained their stranglehold on the economy. Russian pressure intensified through energy blackmail and trade wars. When Yanukovych won the presidency legitimately in 2010, he immediately began dismantling democratic institutions while enriching his cronies from eastern Ukraine. The breaking point came in November 2013, when Yanukovych, under intense Russian pressure, abandoned plans to sign an association agreement with the European Union. A small protest of mostly young Ukrainians began gathering on Independence Square, the Maidan. When riot police brutally dispersed the peaceful protesters, the demonstration exploded into a nationwide uprising. The Euromaidan Revolution of 2013 to 2014 became Ukraine's second great democratic revolution. For months, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians braved freezing temperatures and police violence to demand European integration and an end to corruption. When Yanukovych's forces opened fire on protesters, killing over 100 civilians in what became known as the Heavenly Hundred, the regime's legitimacy collapsed entirely. Putin's response was swift and devastating. As Yanukovych fled to Russia in February 2014, Russian forces without insignia began appearing in Crimea. Within weeks, Putin had annexed the peninsula through a sham referendum conducted under military occupation. Simultaneously, Russian-backed separatists launched rebellions in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region. The war that began in 2014 marked the return of major interstate conflict to Europe. Despite overwhelming Russian advantages in equipment and manpower, Ukrainian forces gradually stabilized the front lines. The conflict claimed over 14,000 lives and displaced millions. But Ukraine's resistance prevented Putin from achieving his goal of turning the country into a failed state. The February 24, 2022, full-scale Russian invasion represented Putin's final attempt to destroy Ukrainian independence forever. His televised address on the eve of invasion echoed the propaganda used by every empire that had ever sought to subjugate Ukraine, denying Ukrainian identity, rewriting history, and claiming Russia's right to rule over its smaller neighbor. But Putin had fatally misunderstood modern Ukraine. The country that resisted his invasion was not the weak, divided state of the 1990s. It was a nation forged by 30 years of independence, 2 democratic revolutions, and 8 years of war. When President Volodymyr Zelensky refused American offers of evacuation and declared, "I need ammunition, not a ride," he spoke for a people who had finally learned the price of freedom. Today, as Ukrainian forces defend their homeland against the largest European war since 1945, they carry forward a tradition stretching back over a millennium. From the democratic assemblies of Kievan Rus to the elected hetmans of the Cossacks, from the poets who preserved Ukrainian identity under imperial oppression to the revolutionaries who reclaimed independence in 1991, Ukraine's story has always been one of resistance to empire and the pursuit of freedom. The outcome of this latest chapter remains unwritten, but one truth has emerged clearly from the crucible of war. Ukraine will never again accept foreign domination. The empire of freedom that the Cossacks dreamed of building has finally found its moment in history.